everyone, and welcome to the pig and poultry session of the Responsible Antibiotic Use in Animals series of webinars, jointly hosted by RUMA and SFAM. My name is Kat McLaughlin. I'm the chairman of RUMA Farm Animals, and as part of that role, I also chair the RUMA Farm Animal Target Task Force and the RUMA Farm Animal Independent Scientific Group. I'm also the Chief Advisor for Animal Health and Welfare Policy in the National Farmers Union, England and Wales, leading on the NFU's strategic policy around animal health and welfare. I've been involved in RUMA Farm Animals for probably about 14 years and worked very closely as Deputy Chair with Gwyn Jones, who you heard from yesterday morning. With RUMA's coordination and support, the UK has had tremendous success in promoting the responsible use of veterinary medicines across the agricultural supply chains. Much of that success has come about through the voluntary work of individual sectors working together and sharing experiences through the RUMA Target Task Force. So some quick headlines. UK sales of antibiotics to treat farm animals have halved since 2014. The UK retains a position of 5th lowest in terms of sales of antibiotics for farm animals in Europe, the lowest amongst more commercially productive European countries, and we're only beaten by Norway, Iceland, Sweden and Finland, but they are very different in terms of climate and food production structures. Sales of the highest priority critically important antibiotics, the HPCIAs for UK farm animals, have also fallen since 2014, and sales of colistin are virtually nil. Less than 30% of the UK's antibiotics are used to treat disease in farm animals, and that's despite more than 1 billion farm animals being reared and managed in the UK every year. And levels of antibiotic resistance found through government monitoring and surveillance are also stabilising and falling in response to reductions in use. And we've achieved all of this through voluntary industry action facilitated by RUMA in collaboration with government agencies and using the industry targets. So this session is about sharing the experiences of the pig and poultry sectors and their supply chains. And we have 3 speakers for you. Our first speaker is Daniel Parker. Now, Daniel is a poultry vet specialist and represented poultry on the RUMA Targets Task Force, but also sits with one of our other speakers, Martin Smith, on the RUMA Independent Scientific Group. Daniel will be talking about antimicrobial stewardship in the UK poultry industry. Then we'll hear from Richard Pearson. Richard is a vet, a pig practitioner. He's the past president of the Pig Veterinary Society, and he represented the pig sector on the RUMA Target Task Force. His talk title is Pigs, Health, Antibiotics and Stewardship. And then we'll finish the session of speakers with Martin Smith, who currently works at Pilgrim's Pride as Head of Veterinary Services. His talk title is Innovations to Deliver Responsible Use of Medicines in Pig Supply Chains. We'll then have time for questions after those 3 speakers. So I think that's us, and I think I will leave you now to the speakers.
Good morning, my name's Daniel Parker, and I'm very pleased to be able to join this conference and share with you some of the experiences the UK poultry meat industry has had in terms of antibiotic reduction. I will give some background to the British Poultry Council's Antibiotic Stewardship Group, some achievements of the UK poultry meat industry, some of the outcomes, and some of the future initiatives that we are looking at going forward. So the British Poultry Council established an antibiotic stewardship group back in 2011. And the background to this was a growing awareness of antimicrobial resistance, increased fluoroquine resistance in foodborne organisms, Campylobacter and Salmonella, growing reports coming from across Europe about extended spectrum beta-lactamase organisms being found in E. coli and Salmonella. And government had already started to intervene in some parts of Europe. So in the Netherlands, there had been an initiative where antibiotic use was going to be legislated, or reductions in antibiotic use was going to be legislated. The poultry meat sector is invariably under targets from the media and NGOs, partly because it's an intensive livestock industry. And one of the issues the industry had was a lack of data. So the members of the British Poultry Council, who are mainly poultry meat producers, came together to initiate the Antibiotic Stewardship Group. So what were the aims and the objectives? Well, the industry members decided to collect antibiotic usage data, because up until this time, the only data that was available was sales data that was collected by government. And the idea was to collect that data and share it within the British Poultry Council members, so that there was a genuine understanding of the actual amount of antibiotics that were being used by the sector. The benefits of this would be that individual companies would know their own total usage, and they could compare it against overall usage of the poultry meat sector. So a level of self-benchmarking could occur. In addition to that, we wanted to share learnings between companies and veterinary practices on how to approach reductions of antibiotic use and more targeted use of antibiotics. We had to make decisions on antibiotic strategies for the industry as a whole, particularly the use of highest priority, critically important antibiotics like cephalosporins, fluoroquinolones, and macrolides. But one of the key aspects of this, it had to be pre-competitive. We didn't want this to become a competitive situation where retailers and food service sectors potentially could use antibiotic use as a lever on purchasing. And this has happened in the United States subsequently and has been very negative for both the industry and for overall antibiotic use. So what have we achieved? This graph shows the sales of antibiotics for food producing animals in blue over the years 2012 to 2019. And in red is the use by the British Poultry Council. This is actually usage, not sales. It's actually usage by the British Poultry Council. And what we can see is that in the early years, there was relatively significant amounts. But as the years have gone on with the stewardship group being in place, that level has reduced significantly. The other positive message from this is that overall in food producing animals in the UK, sales of antibiotics have also reduced over the similar time period. If we get into the actual figures there in terms of antibiotic use and across the different species, if you look at the total antibiotic sales, in 2012, there was 464 tons of antibiotics active sold into all animal species. Of that, 396 tons were going into food producing animals. And of that amount, 20% of that was going into chickens, which was quite interesting because much of the publicity prior to that had been or over 50% of that usage had been going into poultry, and clearly this was not the case. When we move to 2019, we can see there's been substantial reductions both in the amounts that are going into food producing animals, but also more particularly in brackets, what's going into BPC. So we see that in 2019, antibiotic sales in food producing animals was 179 tons. And of that 179 tons, 17.9 tons, i.e. 10.9%, was going into British poultry meat species. I think it's important to note here that also that 68 to 52 tons of active were sold for non-food producing animals, so i.e. pets and horses. So whilst often food producing sector is leveled with using a lot of antibiotics, a significant amount also goes into pet animals. And when we look at the total number of animals, pet animals in the UK, horses, it's a relatively small amount, only 51 million, when you compare it to the number of food producing animals. Furthermore, when we start to look at the One Health report that was published in 2019, and we look at the amount of antibiotics that are used in people versus animals, we can see that substantially more is actually used in people than in animals. So although agriculture and the livestock sectors are often targeted for use of antibiotics, we see in actual fact a far greater proportion is actually used in people. Now, the other thing I want to introduce is the concept of population correction unit. And this is a technical use of measurement which is used to represent the estimated weight of treatment of livestock and slaughtered animals. To calculate it in chickens, what we do is we take the total antibiotic usage and correct it back to 1 kilogram, which is considered to be the average weight that we would expect to treat chicken. So if we look at a 1.8 kilogram chicken and it's treated with 20 milligrams per kilogram for 3 days, we have an equivalent PCU of 60 milligrams per PCU. Whereas if it was a 50-gram chick treated with 20 milligrams per kilogram for 3 days, we have an equivalent PCU of 3 milligrams. Turkeys have a slightly different average weight that they are used to be treated at, as do pigs, as do cattle. But this is a measure that's has been developed by the European Union to try and benchmark use across different species of animals. So when we start to convert what antibiotic use has been in chickens, we can see we look at milligrams per PCU by species, and in chickens we started off in 2014 with 48 milligrams per PCU, and it drops considerably over time to currently we're on 17.45. And we're still slightly concerned. We saw a nadir in 2017 where we were down at 9.85, and there's been a slight increase since then. However, we feel that this is going to stabilize over a number of years. There was a rapid reduction in the early days, and now it's stabilizing, and we will work to reduce that to a lower level. Part of the important part of the PCU figure is that the O'Neill report, which was published in 2016, advised that developed countries should look to keep milligrams per PCU in their agriculture sector below 50. And what we can see here is that the poultry meat industry in the chicken producers in the UK have been under that figure from the outset. And we will continue to try and drive those figures to a lower level. If we look at turkeys, turkeys are slightly different. Higher level of antibiotics per PCU used in turkeys. They're a different animal, a different type of animal, and again, we've had significant reductions, but we don't believe that we will ever get to the sort of levels in turkeys that we see in chickens, simply because of the type of animals and the type of antibiotics that are licensed to use in them. Again, this graph shows the total use of antibiotics in poultry, British Poultry Council's membership over the years 2012 to 2019. And this is in terms of tons of active. And I've put in here the O'Neill report published in 2016 as an arrow. And the reason I put this in is because I want to illustrate that actually the poultry meat industry had already taken the initiative prior to O'Neill drawing his conclusions. We knew that we had to do something about our antibiotic stewardship, and the industry took the initiative itself and undertook to reduce their usage over that time period. When we look at classes, there's different classes of antibiotics used, and by far and away the largest class that's used in poultry is amoxicillins. There are limited numbers of products that are licensed to be used in poultry sector, and that to some extent limits what can be used in the animals. But one of the important factors here is the highly critically important and highest priority critically important antibiotics, particularly the fluoroquinolones, are used in minimal amounts of use in the poultry meat sector. So where are we now? So in the last 7 years, between 2012 and 2019, there's been a 76% reduction in the total use of antibiotics. And most importantly, a 97.3% reduction in the use of critically important antibiotics. And in those, I'm looking at the classes fluoroquinolones, cephalosporins, colistin, and macrolides. And colistin is an interesting antibiotic because prior to the identification of the MCR1 gene, colistin was a widespread antibiotic used across the agricultural sector, particularly in Europe, not so much in the UK. But currently now we have withdrawn that antibiotic voluntarily from use, and whilst it's still licensed, we will we look to minimize the amount of use that we have. So in 2019, this sector, the poultry meat sector, used 19.7 tons of antibiotics, and this accounts for 9.33% of the total antibiotics licensed for food producing animals based on the Veterinary Medicines Directorate's sales data. But the other thing about antibiotic stewardship, it's not just about antibiotic reduction. We don't want to get to a no antibiotics ever approach that is being taken in the US. In part, that's because it's being used as a competitive issue, and that's not the right approach. We need to have medicines to ensure we maintain animal health and welfare, but we will adapt. So as mentioned before, with the identification of the MCR1 gene that confers resistance to colistin, which was reported first in 2015 in China and then 2016 in the USA, the British Poultry Council took the decision to advise their members not to use that antibiotic. Although it was used in very small amounts, we still took that decision to not use it unless it was absolutely necessary. Because ultimately we want to reduce antibiotic resistance to preserve the limited armory of antibiotics that we still have available. We don't have the vast array of antibiotic classes that are licensed in, for example, small animal pet animals, or in humans. And so we need to preserve those that are available to us so they remain effective. One of the interesting things is that when we start to look at what is the impact of reduction of antibiotics, we want to look at what the impact is on resistance profiles. And these two graphs illustrate surveys that were undertaken by the government labs in response to a requirement from EU, which was to look at ESBL carriage, E. coli carriage in E. coli's isolated from chickens. And if we look at the survey, the results here, the survey back in 2016 showed an ESBL carriage in chicken CK, so these were isolated from live chickens, of around about 19%. By 2018, that had dropped down to less than 4%. And when that's sort of transposed into retail chickens looking at ESBL carriage, back in 2014, the levels were up in the high 65%. But by 2018, those had dropped well under 10%. Now, whether that is cause and effect, genuinely, but we believe the reduction in use of antibiotics that stimulate ESBL development has resulted in that reduction, or is whether it's coincidental, we don't know for sure. But either way, it's moving in a very positive direction, which is a good outcome, we think, both for the industry and for the general public. So what about the future? What do we still need to do? Well, we need to have a better understanding of the who, why, and where antibiotics are used. We need to improve the education and training of both veterinarians and also livestock keepers on good antibiotic stewardship. And also what we'd like to see is further studies on the impact of reduction strategies and how they impact on resistance of important organisms. So for example, fluoroquinolone resistance in Campylobacter is currently at moderate levels across the UK. However, fluoroquinolones have not been used in particularly in broiler meat production for the best part of 8 years in the UK, and yet that resistance still persists. So understanding why that resistance still exists, and also potentially how we could modify it to change that. And these are the sorts of questions we need to be looking at towards the future. So thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to try and answer any questions, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Good morning, my name is Richard Pearson. I'm a pig vet and I'm going to give you an update on progress made with antibiotic stewardship and how we have approached the next round of target setting in the pig sector. One health is an important concept for all of us, especially in relation to antibiotics. These are vital medicines. We need them to work and we need them to carry on working. I would like to make it very clear at the outset that the work I present today represents a cross-sectoral approach involving many different organisations, including Pig Veterinary Society, Red Tractor, MPA, AHDB and RUMA. RUMA established a targets task force in late 2016 to formulate targets for each species sector from a 2050 baseline through until 2020. And the original TTF reported its recommendations in 2017. Each sector is represented by a vet and a farmer representative. I would like to make it clear that this was and remains a voluntary programme. In the pig sector, great progress has been achieved with usage recorded by EMB already dropping by over 60% from the 2015 baseline, and I'll show that to you in a minute. Despite health challenges in 2019, the pig sector remained pretty much on track to meet the targets set under that first round of target setting for the sector. The second round of target setting for the sector was aligned with the government's AMR strategy 2020 to 2024. Obviously, there is some overlap there because the original round took us through to 2020 anyway. Good progress so far has been widely recognised. We're in a better place. Cross-sectoral involvement and support has been important and continues to be important. For this second round of target setting, we knew wide consultation was going to be very important. Whilst the programme remains voluntary, in order to maintain progress, we knew we had to introduce elements of nudge and shunt to maintain that progress. And we're also mindful that we had to fit this target setting into the broader context of antibiotic use and health control in pigs. On top of all of that, we were mindful that the proposed changes to EU medicines legislation, which I'll outline shortly, could have profound effects. Okay, a little background. The pig sector has been recognised historically as a high user of antibiotics. Progress so far has pretty much tracked the original targets task force predictions for the sector, and hopefully you can see that in front of you. Great progress has been achieved with us now using well over 60% less antibiotics than we were back in 2015. Someone once used the diet analogy with me in relation to antibiotic reduction. Losing those first few pounds may be relatively easy. Thereafter, life can get slightly more challenging. Okay, the next few slides I'm going to share with you were used in our PVS consultation on the TTF2 proposals, which I did last spring. The idea being to try and set the scene for colleagues in pig practice and try and get some wider consensus and wider support for our proposals. And the idea of the next few slides, which I'll share with you, was to try and place UK pig sector use in some sort of a perspective. Progress in UK agriculture with antibiotic reduction has obviously been significant. The latest published data from the UK VARS report 2019 suggests current use in food producing animals to be just over 30 mg per kg PCU. So that's these are figures comparing 2013 and 2017, and this was the best available data set going back a year ago. So significant progress overall in animals. And we've also got the progress that's been achieved in human medicine here from the UK One Health report. Similar graphics, again, from the UK One Health report 2019. This graphic shows the quantity in tonnes of highest priority, critically important antibiotics used in animals and humans, comparing 2013 and 2017 data. Again, significant progress achieved in animals over this time period, and indeed that progress has been maintained. In 2019, there was a total of 1.25 tonnes of HPCIA use in animals, and only 1 kilo of which was colistin use, and that wasn't used in pigs. Antibiotic use in AMR is, of course, a global issue. What we do on our tiny island is important, but international travel, movement of food, antibiotic production and movement, all of these and many others are big issues. This graphic represents use across all food producing species, I should say, not just pigs. UK use is now at the low to moderate end of the usage league in the EU, and out of the major food producing countries, we're basically right down at the bottom. Broadly speaking, usage in southern EU countries tends to be higher. Usage in Nordic countries tends to be lower. We're often compared for our pig sector to Denmark and Holland, and Danish and Dutch pig usage is believed to be in the low 40s milligrams per kilo PCU. So by overall comparison with people and with other EU countries, UK agriculture doesn't perhaps compare too badly. How do things look compared to other agricultural sectors, or how did things look a year ago, I should say, when we were conducting this consultation? The pig sector has made great progress, but usage remains perhaps relatively high compared to other farm species. And that's both in terms of absolute tonnage used and PCU comparisons. Note good coverage across the listed sectors here. Some of you may have noted that some significant sectors are not shown, and that's because large-scale reliable data sets are just not available yet. Anyway, back to the pigs. Probably fair to say comparisons to the farmed species suggest there is work yet to be done. Here we are in pigs at 110 mg per kg in 2019. Latest data set, as I said, for 2020, 105. I can't overemphasize just how important having data has been to us in the pig sector and the progress we have made. The old adage, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it, certainly applies. AHDB, to their credit, created an excellent tool, the e-medicines book, 6 or 7 years ago. Subsequently, Red Tractor introduced a new standard in relation to antibiotics in 2017, requiring all assured units to submit data to EMB. Red Tractor now covers over 90% of pigs slaughtered in the UK. All of a sudden, we had data and could make progress. So in terms of gaining a greater understanding of pig sector use, this graphic shows the amount of antibiotic administered to pigs by method of administration. And like humans, one of the things I think we take from this is pigs receive most of their treatments orally. It also shows a nice shifting pattern of administration in pigs. It's a little bit small to see, but the orange areas, and these are the years 2016, 17, 18 and 19, basically represent percentage of administration in feed. Above that, the blue area shows percentage of administration in water. So we see a nice shifting pattern of administration reflecting a more targeted approach to treatment. This graphic shows a breakdown of the 2,500 or so UK pig farms submitting data to EMB, broken down by usage level in 50 milligram increments. The majority of UK pig farms now use very low levels of antibiotics. Nearly 60% of sites use less than 50 mg per kg, and that's this bar here. And 93% of sites use less than 300 milligrams, and it's a bit hard to see because it is small, but that's up to here. This sort of insight helps steer our TTF2 submission. So some key differences from the first round of target setting for the pig sector as we approach the second round. We were definitely in a better place, but the playing field also looked pretty different. The positives, we had data. Secondly, and importantly, we had progress in the bank. The negatives, okay, we still had considerable uncertainty regarding implementation and impacts of EU medicines legislation, which is due to be enforced from next January. We also had considerable uncertainty regarding a proposed EU ban on therapeutic zinc oxide in weaner rations, which is due to be enforced from next June, just about a year from now. That uncertainty remains, and these created difficulties in trying to plot a course forward for the pig sector. The legislative changes proposed next year do certainly have the potential to substantially change the playing field with respect to pig health management. These changes will have complex and interrelated effects that are hard to predict. Interpretation of these pieces of legislation by our competent authority, the VMD, could also have a significant effect. In our decision, in our considerations, we expected the overall effect to exert significant downward pressure on usage, and also to possibly encourage further shift in mode of delivery from feed to water. This is basically a very brief summary of some of the more major elements of the legislative changes that are proposed at an EU level. A ban on group prophylactic use of antibiotics, an MFSP, and that's a medicated feeding stuffs supplements. That's a prescription for in-feed medication for antibiotics to only be valid for 5 days and for a maximum 14-day course of treatment, and tighter restrictions on antibiotic carryover in feed mill operations also proposed. So moving on to where we eventually got to in terms of our proposals for the pig sector. The numerical targets. Direction of travel with respect to TTF2 in the pig sector will remain downward. It must, and it will. We'd targeted a further 30% reduction from 2020 figures through to 2024, and that comes out with about 73 milligrams per kilo PCU target for 2024. And that, if achieved, will represent something like a 75% reduction from the 2015 baseline. The steady parabolic decline we have seen today may not be so smooth going forward. We know that we achieve lower levels of use disease outbreaks, as we experienced in 2019 with swine dysentery, can have greater impacts. We also know that these elements of EU legislation could have distinct impacts and upset the curve somewhat. It was recognised that achieving lower use per se was going to become increasingly difficult without digging down a little deeper into what was actually driving that use, and indeed where that use was occurring. This was the idea behind creating some non-numerical targets alongside the numbers themselves. You will remember seeing the graph showing the number of units by usage level that I showed earlier. Large numbers of units use very little antibiotics and a small number use quite a lot. The following ideas for PHUs, that's persistently high users, came from a desire to encourage these higher users to address their use. At the end of the day, if the mass of the sector were making great progress and trying hard, why should a small number be allowed to not engage with the process? Producers in the nuts and bolts of the PHU actions revolve around EMB, the Electronic Medicines Book. Now, producers in the top 10% will receive automated warning that they are indeed in the top 10%. The top 5% of users in each holding category will be classified as PHU, persistently high user, and advised to develop an ARP, an antibiotic reduction plan, with their veterinary surgeon. Now, another key thing I think in our overall process and our overall thinking here was that engagement with farm assurance schemes has been a key element. I mentioned earlier Red Tractor introducing a requirement for recording under EMB, and they're currently consulting on further proposals with respect to antibiotic control, which we think will be really helpful in the overall process. I should also say that the threshold for PHU definitions are holding type specific. We knew that usage varied very significantly between different types of pig farm, e.g. breeding herd only farms used a lot less antibiotics than a nursery unit catering for a young naive population. PHU definitions are also based on a 12-month rolling data set to even out short-term fluctuations. It should do exactly what it says on the tin, i.e. persistently high users. So we built around the numerical targets a whole series of other non-numerical targets to try and support those numbers. Firstly, we knew it was going to be important to monitor the effect of reduced antibiotic use on health. At the end of the day, the last thing any of us wanted to do was to reduce antibiotic use to meet arbitrary targets, but throw pig health and welfare out of the window. Secondly, we wanted to encourage timely submission and engagement with EMB for all pig producers, including non-assured units. That's really good. We get a lot of good data in, but keeping it coming in a timely fashion from all units is a priority. Addressing weaner management, particularly against the backdrop of therapeutic zinc oxide ban in 2022, we also proposed as a target to try and support producers. Facilitating shift in mode of delivery from feed to water medication, I've already mentioned as being a target. That already is happening, but if that could be encouraged and facilitated, then we think that targeted approach is very much the direction we would like to take. Obviously, one of the major issues with antibiotic use, and probably in fact the major use, is its influence on AMR. And we know that we want to continue monitoring the effect of hopefully reduced use of antibiotics on AMR via the VARS report and other data sources. And lastly, we wanted to encourage training in responsible antibiotic use and also understanding of AMR across the sector, because that helps place antibiotic use. Some fairly left field concepts, at least for a jobbing pig vet like myself. Ownership, mindset and momentum have been significant. The sector has acknowledged an issue. It's challenged itself. Okay, how are we going to approach things? How are we going to address pig health management going forward with lower reliance on antibiotics? We've obviously achieved some momentum and some great progress so far, and I think we're all anxious that that momentum is maintained into the second round of targets. Another key point, data remains the key. I've said this already, if you haven't got data, you really can't do very much at all, and EMB has been crucial to us. I would like to just emphasise how important the vet-farmer relationship has been in all of this. That relationship is built on trust. It's a long-term relationship between vets and farmers, and really, if that relationship works well, then we can achieve a good result for the pigs, and so also in terms of antibiotic use. Sometimes brave decisions have to be made, and trust is a crucial element there. EU legislation and UK interpretation, indeed, I've already mentioned, and they will significantly affect our trajectory with regard to antibiotics in the next few years, without a shadow of doubt. The direction of travel for us in the pig sector must and will remain downward. The focus will be on good antibiotic stewardship, I should say, though, not on zero use. These are important medicines for us. The challenges remain in the pig sector. PR is not my area of expertise, but just to show you some of the things that we face, these are two recent headlines concerning the same story picked up by the Guardian, stating that use of aminoglycoside antibiotics, as recorded by EMB, has doubled. And these are recent stories within the last couple of weeks. And the BMJ, British Medical Journal, also picked up on the story and featured it recently. Having data can be a double-edged sword. It can also be a stick to beat you with, but I wouldn't be without it. It's frustrating, as aminoglycoside use is just such a small fraction of use in the pig sector, and doubling a tiny amount of not very much is still a tiny amount. It certainly ignores the bigger picture of big overall reductions, and it's annoying for those of us who have been at the sharp end of trying to steer a path forward for the pig sector, but life was ever thus. Okay, that's just about all I've got to say. Thank you very much for listening, and yeah, thank you.
Hello, I'm Martin Smith. I'm the Head of Veterinary Services for Pilgrims UK, and I'll be speaking on chain reactions, which is looking at the supply chains and their involvement in antibiotic stewardship. So in overview, what I will be looking at is sort of more detail in terms of the supply chain, on how the supply chain can affect antibiotic stewardship, and what influencing factors there are that we can use to affect change. So looking at the actors in the supply chain, this probably is going to go back to some basics and things that maybe many of us already know, but we need to be aware of the fact that the supply chain has multiple stakeholders, and the very base, if we're looking farm to fork, that it's the farmers and the vets really who have the ownership of health and antibiotic use that's happening out on farm. So processors, they sort of sit a little bit in the middle as processors and manufacturers. They are under obligation to provide a final customer requirement, so there are pressures on them to deliver, especially on areas such as antimicrobial stewardship, but they also have to maintain supplies, so they need to maintain their relationships with the farmers and vets, and so there's an invested interest in supporting earlier parts within the supply. And then you have retailers and food service, and they have pressures coming from the customers, so from the consumers, you and I, but also from NGOs, so campaign groups, and they also have their own brand to manage, so they've got a reputational risk if they're moving off brand or if something goes wrong, so they have a number of pressures acting upon them. So looking at a conventional supply chain where we sort of have, the farm, the processor, the retailer, the consumer, and sort of the standard chain of command that goes down that. What we also would see within that is probably a retrograde flow of command then from consumer all the way back to the farmer, but probably more centering on the retailer, and I'll go into that a little bit later. But also we have these additional supply requirements going around that, and in part there's the state, so there's governmental influence, and a lot of the changes that were made in terms of antimicrobial recording and stewardship within livestock was driven by the state and government and DEFRA, but also NGOs. And I think the NGO is important because that's sort of the campaigner, but also the media and the pressures and the pressure points that they exert. And really, they're trying to push on all of the players within the supply chain, so the farmers, the processors, but actually even into government as well. So there's quite a lot of a dynamic flow of influence and of control within the supply chain when you look at it in regards to antibiotic stewardship. And if we look at what people want, so a lot of this is sort of saying, well, the consumers at the end of the supply chain, are they the driver? And I think that may be not quite as simple as we think, because antibiotic reduction really has been seen as an ethical or common good, and I think that the consumers probably haven't been demanding it that much. It does depend on country to country, but I think that the consumer by and large sort of will have a degree of trust in the products that they have, and sort of take sort of good stewardship, good animal management, good health as being as something that they expect as standard. So we're not probably getting our campaign pressures coming from them. And probably the UK consumer is really quite cost sensitive, so really they're not wanting to pay a premium necessarily for low antibiotic use or specific requirements on antibiotic stewardship. There will always be the individuals that are very keyed into this as an area, and probably will look for specific parts, but it's still quite part of a niche part of the market. And we have to bear in mind that what people want will also depend a bit on which country you're in. So, the ideas around what good welfare looks like will have an influence on the management types that you have within the sector, but also the idea of antibiotic-free markets seems to be more prevalent in the USA, and that probably, and I can't say definitively, but that probably is down to the fact that there isn't as much assurance in terms of standards across protein production, and that the antibiotics are not wholly under veterinary control, so you can buy antibiotics over the counter in certain circumstances, and there is still some growth promotion being used within that country. So therefore consumers have more concern and probably are more vocal about what they want, and therefore things like antibiotic free has come to the fore. But what we will always have, and I think sometimes they may be speaking on behalf of consumers, or they think they're speaking on behalf of consumers, is campaign groups, and they will try to drive the agenda of AMR in the public domain, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. So where is the industry currently? Well, this probably is going back a little bit onto the previous speakers' areas, which is looking at what are the other supply chains doing. But there was a clear mandate that was given to livestock in the UK in the form of the O'Neill report in 2016, and this really was a call to arms for the livestock industry. And the reason why the O'Neill report is also quite important in the context of this talk is the fact that there were recommendations both given in the report, but also subsequently by Lord O'Neill, suggesting that retailers and the supply chain have a great role to play, and probably needed to step up a little bit. So I will bring that up later on. The more commercial livestock chains or supply chains, so the pig and poultry, probably have faced the highest scrutiny in terms of the volumes of antibiotics being used. And in part, high volumes were being used because of the biomass and the relatively quick turnaround time from farm to fork. But on the other hand, there was room for improvement, and that was something that the sector's feeling the pressure and scrutiny from government and from other forces, decided to become a little bit more coordinated in their response. And so we're well placed to do that due to the fact that the supply chains are more consolidated and integrated with pig and poultry more than other sectors. And what you'd see now, looking at the more extensive sectors, the ones that are less integrated, so sort of your sheep, your lamb, your cattle, they found it more challenging because they have so many more stakeholders involved. There's probably less pressures in terms of their antibiotic use, and they don't really have this integration. So to some extent, if we're looking at how the supply chain can drive and affect change, more integrated supply chains can drive and affect change more quickly, because there's less people to influence, and the markets can pull together quite a bit easier. And you know, as I mentioned before, Lord O'Neill has been quite a vocal advocate of supply chains and the retailers in particular in having their opportunity to influence change through the market forces. And I've just put up a sort of 10 points that were raised. It's sort of really a real précis summary of the outcomes of the O'Neill report. And where we've probably focused on mainly has been the antibiotics in agriculture and the environment, and that's been the main area. But I would also like to sort of show the areas such as the vaccines and alternatives, rapid diagnostics, public awareness, and the global innovation fund. Those sort of areas, they are the sorts of things that probably will be the next steps or bits that are needed to really sort of catapult our industry further forward, probably through our supply chains. So I'm coming on to a section here which I'm calling What's in the Box, and it's a bit of maybe a philosophical exercise, but really the way I like to visualize our current situation in terms of prescribing in livestock is that we have a box, and within that box we have all of the antibiotic products available that we will have probably from now on in. And the challenge that we have is that we're not going to get any more, and there is the very great likelihood that there may have products removed from that box due to changes in terms of medicine practices, or if new classes of antibiotics are developed that are analogues or homologues of ones that exist in veterinary medicine. So we're likely to have more restrictions on what we have, and we already have a very finite amount of products. So when we're looking at developing strategies, policies, whatever it is around antibiotic stewardship, we have to think that we already are in a position of limited resource, and we're having to make do with what we've got. The other thing is any resistance developing in veterinary medicine, we are going to be limited by the products that we have available to us, and we won't have anything else. So it's within our own interest as clinicians and as a sector to look after what we've already got. It also raises the conundrum, which is if we start to get pressures to put bans or restrictions in place of particular categories of antibiotics, then you're going to put further pressure on the finite commodity that we have when it comes to antibiotics. So this slide really is looking at the risks of a supply-led change. So if Lord O'Neill's idea is sound and we're going down the route of the supply chain leading our direction, what could go wrong? Well, one of the challenges is that the supply chain is quite long. Sometimes it can be quite complicated. I mean, what I've shown in the diagram earlier was quite simplistic. The sectors can, be quite distanced if you look at the retailer compared to the farmer. So they can be quite distant from the realities of what's going on in livestock production and the challenges being faced by them, and the diseases that they may be encountering. And there's often a lack of understanding about certain clinical practices and justifications. And I think you might have heard already about the use of antibiotics for elimination strategies. So looking at using a short course of a high level of antibiotic to eliminate a pathogen from a supply, which means that long-term antibiotic use is reduced. So that would be an unusual way of using an antibiotic, but actually is quite a responsible way to use it if you are trying to lead to lower antibiotics in the long term. So there are sometimes slight quirks in terms of how clinical practice will deviate maybe from what would be the clinical norm. There's also a lack of coordination and consistency between the commercial customer standards. So we generally would talk about the red tractor standards, which is an audit standard that's across each livestock sector, and RSPCA will be there as well as the organic standards. But retailers have their own requirements, then their own standards that they will stick on top of that. And these standards really are retailer to retailer. They are not necessarily unified in a sort of like a common retailer standard, and that's broadly because retailers have their own points of differentiation. They are in a commercial market, they're in competition with each other, so there hasn't been a need to have any consistency between them, because it depends from retailer to retailer. But in the case of antibiotics, what would be very dangerous is actually to have huge differences that actually are driving dependence on fewer and fewer antibiotic classes. And the other thing is the sort of sensitivity to NGO, so campaign group and public opinion. So there's always going to be a risk about these idea of sort of the quasi ban. So the idea of, oh, well, the supply chain just decided to ban a particular class of antibiotics. And the reason why that is difficult is because a ban is finite, and there's a whole public health, public perception issue around putting bans in place if you ever need to rescind on that. And I think it fails to recognise that the profiles of pathogens within livestock sectors and within the industry will change over time, and we really cannot see into the future exactly what is going to happen and when we might need these products in future. So to put a ban in place, we have to be very sure that we won't need it again. So restrictions and regulation probably are more important, and clear practices and best practice guidelines probably than going down the full route of saying let's ban a product. And that's always going to be the slight challenge, because there's quite a lot of pressure in many cases when there are public health issues to put a ban in livestock sectors. So who should be in the driving seat? And I've sort of put up 6 points here really. So we've already discussed Lord O'Neill's idea that the retailer should be in the driving seat to some extent, and through market forces probably is. But we have to recognise that the biology of antimicrobial resistance is not simple, and that there are real nuances in terms of how you might want to prescribe. We can't look at one size fits all, so sector to sector is going to change, but also supply chain to supply chain is going to change. So there needs to be clinical judgment based on a collective as to what good looks like and what a standard looks like. And there also needs to be continual dialogue up and down that chain, because there's no point in setting a standard if it actually can't be implemented on the ground. And then the final part is really sort of trusting in the veterinary professionalism and judgment, because I think sometimes there is that perception that, you know, vets being paid for in many cases by the farmer, that they are really in the pocket of the farmer, that they don't have any role to play in terms of judgment. And I think that's really far from the truth. I think it's not the reality. And actually veterinary professionalism is key in this, and we do need to trust the vets in terms of providing the break, the control in terms of when antibiotics are appropriate to be used. So I'm now going on to what I would calling an unusual alliance, and this is talking about the food industry initiative on antimicrobials, which is a group that was formed in 2019, and it's an alliance between manufacturers, processors, retail and food service, and they came together with a common aim to aid antimicrobial stewardship. And the reason this is an unusual alliance is because these are normally businesses that are in competition with each other, and the idea is that we are moving towards the recognition that AMR is pre-competitive and that we need to work between rival companies to drive forward change. There's no point in everyone pulling in their own direction, because we won't see any change happening. And part of the work that has been going on, which is probably more complicated than can be appreciated, is trying to unify common terminologies in terms of CIA classifications, recognition of what is prophylactic use, what is metaphylactic use, because those definitions are out there in multiple formats. And again, it was mentioned in the O'Neill report that is something that needs to be simplified, but no progress has been made. So this is being done, by industry itself. And the other thing is that the membership group of the FIA is really quite powerful, because we have representatives from the key major retailers, the key major fast food outlets, and so they have a huge opportunity to drive change for the industry. So where do we go to in future? Well, bacteriophages and rapid penside diagnostics, again, they are things that have been touted for quite a while and would make significant difference to us if they were available in the livestock sector. The challenge is that they probably aren't hugely profitable to release into the veterinary sphere, and so we've really seen a failure to get anything that's being developed into the marketplace and ready to use. But they would both give us alternatives to utilizing therapeutics such as antibiotics, but also would give us more assurance in terms of making the right diagnostic in real time, because we're waiting otherwise for several days, if not weeks, to get more information to base our clinical judgment upon. Better genetics and changes in agricultural practices, they will also help to drive change, and they'll happen over time anyway, but that could be accelerated if there was more financial incentives within the sector to improve on change, and that could be coming from a fund by the industry, so maybe retailers sort of putting money into a fund, or that could be partly through the new sort of government pathways that are being sort of talked about as the successor to subsidies. Unification of retailer standards and sort of one classification list for antibiotics would really help, and that's what FIA are sort of starting to look at, but trying to bring together this idea of one pre-competitive approach across the industry, and also looking at using the influence of UK supply chains and the big companies on the global supply chains coming into agriculture. And the last point, which is something that was raised in O'Neill, which is applicable and actually has great parallels with other things that go on within retail, is actually the use of corporate social responsibility auditing within the active ingredients, the active pharmaceutical ingredients that are used within antibiotics. A lot of these APIs are actually developed in emerging and developing countries, and often with fairly low levels of regulation around environmental contamination. If you look at other things that the retailers would buy, everything through from feathers in your feather pillow all the way through to the herbs in your sausage, there is actually auditing that goes back to look at the environmental impact and modern slavery. And they have all been investigated, but I think that actually antibiotics and APIs and antibiotics has never really been touched, and I think that's something that does need to be done. So that may happen in future, and maybe retailers will lead on that. But really, in summary of my talk, I think the supply chain has great influence on production, and to some extent that has been used to date, but I think we're looking at the moment to get more coordination. Antibiotic stewardship is a common good, and it needs to be recognised as pre-competitive. It probably isn't at the moment the main concern of the consumer, but it could quite quickly change, so we have to do something about it. There are risks in being too reactive, so being too quick to make changes, and actually any bans or any restrictions need to be made in a cerebral way and consulted with, to make sure that it's not going to cause problems in future, and that we're not going to be putting more emphasis on certain types of antibiotics that are currently within our in our box, as it were. The wider sphere of influence that we have within supply chains probably is needed to drive access to better tools for farms, so your bacteriophages, novel diagnostics that I mentioned, and I think that equivalence in the standard for imported products is also really important, because if we can also influence change more globally, then that is going to help drive down antimicrobial resistance. So I hope that's been an interesting talk, and thank you very much for your time.
Okay, thank you very much. So we've now got the Q&A session with all of our three speakers. We've had quite a lot of questions have come in. What I'm going to try and do is group some of the questions together into key themes, just to try and get as much out of this session as we can. We might end up running over kind of an extra 5 or 10 minutes, just to say we've got a lot of really good questions, and I want to try and get as much out of this session as possible. So we've got questions around reduction. Are there reductions through prophylaxis or treatment of infection? Do we get most control through probiotics? What role does vaccination have? Have improvements been achieved through biosecurity? And I'm going to actually invite Daniel to kick off.
Yeah, thanks, Kat. In terms of prophylaxis versus treatment and reduction of antimicrobial use, certainly in the early days, in our experience, the big steps we made was the removal of prophylactic treatment. That led to some substantial reductions in antimicrobial use. In terms of the vaccines, use of vaccines, for example, there are not a huge number of bacterial vaccines available for poultry, licensed for poultry. The majority of the vaccines that are licensed are aimed at viral pathogens. But one of the consequences we tend to see in poultry is, after they've had a viral infection, they'll often get a secondary bacterial infection, which is why there is use of antibiotics for treatment. So yes, the use of vaccines has been a very valuable tool for prevention of disease in poultry. And the final aspect in terms of probiotics, use of probiotics has increased significantly. We find that often a lot of the problems that arise in poultry are related to enteric entry of organisms. And if we can get a good, stable enteric flora in poultry, we can mitigate some of the secondary bacterial infections we see as a result. So the use of competitive exclusion products, which are undefined products, effectively equivalent to a cecal transplant that would be used in humans, are used quite extensively in poultry to establish a good intestinal flora and prevent those gut entry organisms.
Okay, Richard, do you want to add anything more?
Yes, thanks, Kat. I'd obviously agree with what Daniel said in relation to prophylaxis and therapy. The reductions that we've seen in the pig sector really do reflect reduced use of antibiotics for both prophylaxis and also for therapy. At the end of the day, reducing antibiotics boiled down to its base level is if you farm healthy animals, pigs or anything else, you don't need to use very much antibiotics at all. And so that's been the major driver. The other major driver, I think, has been a much more targeted approach in the pig sector to use, to really target treatment on the pigs that absolutely need it when they absolutely need it. And we see that reflected in the shift in administration that I highlighted, I think, during my presentation, from the in-feed mode of delivery to more in-water delivery. And we expect that shift in administration to continue, I think, going forward. Vaccination use, just to mention briefly in the pig sector, we do use vaccines very, very widely now in the pig sector for a whole range of bacterial and viral conditions. And I think as antimicrobial use has diminished, we've seen gradually increased use of vaccines both in breeding animals and in young stock to try and prevent disease occurring in the first place. So it's an important pillar of our health control options and very important to us. Unfortunately, not every single disease that pigs suffer from can be protected against using vaccines, though.
And Martin, I'm just going to bring you in to ask a very specific question that's come in from Roger that links with what Richard has just said. Why is in-water AMU better than in-feed for pigs?
I think we've got to be careful with the term better because they really are used for different purposes. So in-water medication is probably becoming more popular because it's more targeted. It can be used quicker, so we can apply it to, or give it to the animals quicker. So there's definite advantages with that. And it also is very difficult if you're using any extensive production systems, so free range or outdoor production. It's very difficult to give water in those systems without pressurized pipelines. So there still is quite a lot, and certainly in the pig industry, you know, almost a half, not quite, but almost a half of breeding sows are outdoors. If they need to be medicated for whatever reason, you are limited in how you can give that. So in-feed still has its purpose. It is very simple to use. It is, it is a very effective way of giving the right dosage, but it does take time to get into the animals because it has the milling time included, and sometimes the course lengths are longer because you are on a load of feed that's been medicated rather than with the powder going into the water. So they have their own uses.
Right, there's a couple of other questions that again are kind of linked. Well, certainly I'm going to link them together. So we've got a question about harmonizing definitions. So should definitions not be harmonized by the WHO, FAO, OIE, as industry definitions would not necessarily be accepted? We've also got a question around the Brexit impact upon rules, compliance and legislation. And then we've got a couple of other questions that are asking about the global problem of AMR and bacterial species that represent the global problem of AMR. So I think it'll be handled better, I think, if we kind of link them all together and get a little bit of a feel for where we think that overall global picture with, you know, kind of the situation that we've got. You know, are we talking as well about the global problem of AMR in humans or in animals? Obviously, this section, it's about kind of farm animals, and then kind of looking at standards and definitions. So I'm going to kick off, I think, with Martin, while we've got you, and then I'll come to Daniel and Richard if they want to add anything as well.
Yeah, so from a global perspective, in terms of resistance, resistance profiles, I think, vary really from country to country and system to system. So it's quite hard to sort of say these are the prevailing bacterial species that are causing problems globally. And obviously the strain types will vary from region to region. Yeah, so the listings, the groupings from WHO, EMA, etc., they do, it's quite difficult to make them into one consolidated list because the bacterial species and the resistance profiles will change from area to area. However, there does need to be some sort of recognition and consensus.
I might just see if Richard or Daniel want to come in at this stage and add anything more. Richard.
Yeah, I think just in terms of the overall concepts that are being talked about here, look, we're really focused on antibiotics and antibiotics working and continuing to work in pigs. That's what's important to us, that there's a bigger picture there, that's human use, that's use in other species, global use, and the issues that we face aren't just surrounding use, they're surrounding production of antibiotics, they're now surrounding environmental contamination with antibiotics. So I think where we're basically at is that we have all got a duty to do our bit to ensure responsible use of these important medicines, just to try and make sure that they keep working for all of us. And primarily in our sector, you know, we need antibiotics to keep working in pigs. And likewise in human medicine, we obviously need them to keep working. Most of those AMR issues are confirmed within species, with some minor exceptions where transfer of resistance can occur. But we all share those common concerns and common concepts to keep antibiotics working for us.
Daniel, do you want to come in?
Yeah, Kat, just like to add a couple of comments, really. I think the first thing is that different countries are moving at different speeds on all aspects, whether it's antimicrobial use or global warming, etc. And therefore, when you're looking at bodies like WHO, FAO, etc., they have different priorities and different pressures due to the politics. We can only manage and try and control what's within our own area. And Rich is absolutely right. You know, our approach is that we're looking to manage antimicrobial use within the poultry sector, to minimize use, to ensure that those products remain viable for us, and that the products we produce are healthy and safe for the consumer. So from that perspective, that is our aim. In terms of spread of organisms through livestock, that is limited again within a UK perspective, because we as a country tend not to import a huge amount of stock, which is potentially how it's going to be imported in live animals. When we start to talk about products, that's a completely different scenario, and of course that's one of our concerns as as part of the agricultural industry, is in a new global environment, we can manage what we produce here, but we can't necessarily manage what's going to come in imported food. And from that perspective, all right, we need to ensure that, you know, consumers out there support British agriculture and support the approach that we're taking to manage these important products, both for our own production, but also for, you know, wider society.
So I think we've also really kind of answered. John Redshaw had just submitted a question. Are we mainly concerned about antibiotics and antibiotic resistance? And I think some of that has already been answered in that last conversation. I'm just going to throw in a bit of a chairman prerogative here, and just going to basically say that actually it is quite an important question that John has asked. And certainly from RUMA's point of view, RUMA farm animals is about responsible use of medicines. So yes, okay, we've been looking at responsible use of antibiotics to try and mitigate against the risk of antibiotic resistance. But, you know, across the UK farm animal supply chain, you know, we are also very much concerned about the responsible use of all veterinary medicines, you know, and making sure that the medicines that we have, we retain the use of them, the effectiveness of them for as long as possible. And that's what responsible use in my mind is about. I just wonder, though, if I can throw a question to the three speakers and say, Chairman's prerogative on this one, I'm afraid. What are your opinions quickly about the marketing claims around antibiotic free? Because I know with global trade coming down the line, that's going to be quite an important and quite a vocal debate. And there's huge potential to confuse consumers quite a lot. So I just wondered if you wanted to just kind of give me your opinions on antibiotic free as a label. I'm going to try, we'll try Martin again.
I think it's a difficult one. You are almost sort of saying that using antibiotics is a wrong thing to do. And, you know, ultimately, if animals do need treatment, they do need treatment. And it's more about how responsible you are with that treatment, which really should come first. So it is a dangerous thing to look at. The other thing is that it does require systems that are, you know, very much funneling livestock down the route of having treated and non-treated animals. So you sort of, in effect, are creating a sort of a two-tier system. Which I don't think is a very healthy message.
Daniel, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, 100% agree with that. At the end of the day, the approach that we need to take is responsible use, minimizing the amount of antibiotics we use by ensuring we've got good systems, good management, good healthy stock. But we must retain, in my view, the ability to use medicines to preserve the welfare of animals that are sick. That's an absolute imperative. And some of the approaches that have been taken in certain countries with antibiotic free, I think, quite frankly, is a marketing lie that is actually given to the consumer. Yes, you can have antibiotic free, but what happens to the animals that get treated, or don't they treat them? If they don't treat them, there's a welfare aspect. If they do treat them, what do they do with that product? They sell it to the poor people. I mean, that's wrong. That's, you know, ethically and morally wrong, in my view. So no, I think we need to be able to continue to use antibiotics to treat animals to preserve their health and welfare. But we need to be responsible in how we use them. And that is the approach that our industry has taken and will continue to take to ensure that we do provide the best products for our consumers.
Thank you. Richard?
Yeah, just one last thing. I suppose it's a small point, but the pharmaceutical companies go to great lengths to establish and a lot of effort to establish maximum residue levels for all medicines for use in food producing species. So in effect, all food should be antibiotic free. So that was just one point. The other point is really just echoing what the other speakers have just said. I think we're all wary about any systems of production and retailers using marketing claims enzymes that might ultimately disincentivize treatment of animals that require treatment, and then the adverse effects on health and animal welfare that may come from that. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we've got to the end of all of the questions. I want to thank everyone in the audience for their attention, and to those people who submitted questions, thank you very much. There were some really good questions there. But more importantly, I would like to thank as well the three speakers, Martin, Daniel and Richard. Fantastic presentations and really good discussion afterwards. So that's the end of this session. I hope you've all enjoyed it. Thank you very much to our partners in SFAM as well for making this happen. I think it's been a really good couple of days. Thank you.